So what Mark Milke did was he took this concept, the 1867 project, just a simple research question: should Canada be canceled or cherished? And pulled in 20 different voices, as diverse of Canadians as you can find, all over from all over the country, totally different backgrounds, both in terms of their upbringing, but also in terms of their disciplines and their specialties, and asking this question. So what I want to present, and so this is the proof of concept. And then this book has been a bestseller on Amazon dossier. And
Well,
so from this, we're essentially building off of this in terms of where we're focusing as a think tank, because there's obviously a gap here that needs to be addressed.
right.
So that's the focus today. Should Canada be canceled or cherished? And again,
Mm.
every opinion you hear is not my own, so don't shoot the messenger. I'm going to pull the opinions of 20 others who are smarter than I, and essentially how I've broken down the presentation is I'm going to give roughly two quick slides for each of the co-authors. We're
Right.
just some quick quotes, and we'll blitz through it, and then hopefully have time for
Yeah,
questions.
we got
So
lots of time. Yeah.
three kind of parts I want to break it down into. So the first, there's about 4 or 5 root issues, from which Canada is getting its identity crisis. If, if,
Mm.
if I could simplify what the problem is, and the embrace of some utopian,
Right.
unrealistic ideas, and our loss of being grounded in reality. And
Right.
then secondly, looking at the history that has been canceled. So Sir John A. Macdonald, Egerton Ryerson, and others,
Yeah.
looking at the complexity of that history. And although, yes, not one of them was perfect, and there most certainly are things worth criticizing, but let's take it. Let's take a proper view and look at that. And then lastly, well, how do we move forward? And what are some of the lingering issues that still need to be addressed? So from the back of the book, you'll see the ground zero, assaults on historical figures, to cancel culture, to charges that our country is genocidal. Um, our country is under attack, and I would just give one quick anecdote. It was either 2017 or 2018, forget the exact year, when
Mm.
the city of Victoria, took the lead by being the first one to take down Sir John A. Macdonald's statue. And
Mm.
I remember catching wind of this, and I think it was a Friday, because they announced it before anyone could do anything, like late in the week when no one could respond to it. So it was like a Friday afternoon or Friday evening, if my memory serves correctly.
Right.
And I couldn't fall asleep. I was so irritated. Like, come on, people, you're taking down Sir John A's statue. And so I think it took me 20 minutes, maybe 30, just on my phone, typed up a quick Facebook post, just listing off a few just simple historical facts to set the record straight. Like, if you judge this guy justly, meaning up against his peers, stepping into a time machine, going back to the 1840s, in the world that McDonald lived, how should this guy be judged? And that went viral. Danielle Smith, who's now Premier of Alberta, had a radio show in Calgary. She invited me onto the show to talk about this Facebook post that had a gazillion shares. So that was my brief moment of fame in terms of going viral. But this book is going to unpack how did that happen. So the problem, first and foremost, a grievance culture. So if we look here at average weekly earnings of Canadian-born men, and we break it down by ancestry, this is Statistics Canada data. Where do the white men lie? Okay, and this is not a bad thing. Neither is it a good thing. It is what it is. These are the facts. Um, Now, if we look at Canadian-born women, look how far down whites move. So just we have 2 studies that unpack this in detail, looking at tons of variables, controlling for a variety of things, but just on a very simple surface level. If Canada was a systemically racist country, I'm pretty sure this number would be different, and the positioning would be different of the majority population. Um, and this then feeds into identity politics and what is wrong with that. So, quoting Matthew Lau here, so he talks about how if the typical anti-racist activist today is looking for widespread systemic racism, where are they going to find it? Let's skip to the end of the quote. Where they're going to find it is discrimination practiced in the name of social justice or anti-racism. That's where the discrimination is happening these days. Rima Azar, a professor, I believe she's in the University of New Brunswick, or she's one of the universities out that way. Um, she left Lebanon when the civil war was happening there. That civil war was caused because of identity politics. And if we look at history, um, That is the theme. That's what identity politics leads to. So to grasp the danger of modern identity politics, one must realize that in this movement, we're both defined by our identity and trapped by others into it. According to those who see all of us not as individuals, but by characteristics we can't control. It thus helps to remember that dividing people in such ways is not new, and history teaches us it is dangerous. Like that's why this is a problem. It genuinely is dangerous, and it's naive to think otherwise. Gordon Clark, in his chapter, gets into politicized propaganda and how some of the problems in media. So treating other citizens as enemies and canceling them because one dislikes their publicly expressed views is dangerously close to totalitarian. He goes on to talk about the safe space in journalism and how woke ideology, how that dominates the media space. You can read the details in his chapter, but how like this is there's a totalitarian nature here to this, which is why cancel culture needs to be opposed, which is why radical censorship needs to be opposed. Bruce Gilley in his chapter. He gets into a professor, an excellent scholar, who in 2021 was canceled, and now there's been many more since then. But he gets into the details of this, and what this professor did was essentially present some very inconvenient facts about indigenous issues, and just pushing back on the ideology. So, and of course was canceled for that. So the details are important. One wonders if this will be the sort of bare-knuckled Stalinist purge that finally alerts citizens in Western countries to the mortal danger posed to their societies by out-of-control radical movements in contemporary institutions of higher ed. For Canada, the Widdowson liquidation could not be more germane in the drift of a once great country into guilt-racked paralysis. This affair what the affair makes plain is that any university that embraces indigenization or decolonization or racial justice, which, may I insert, is all of them in this country, public universities, that is, if they include that as part of their mission, that they have then given up on science, they've given up on debate, they've given up on truth seeking, much in the way universities subscribe. Oh, yeah, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's his quote there. It cannot escape notice that the very things these activists charge the residential schools with, which is, of course, fostering and perpetuating an abusive environment, forced indoctrination, forced assimilation into intolerant norms, et cetera, those are exactly the things the universities are doing. And some may say that's hyperbolic, but not really. It's the same root. It's the same ideology. So David Miller Haskell in his chapter talks about unconscious bias. So this is another issue. So we've had cancel culture, identity politics, grievance culture, politicized propaganda. Well, let's get one layer deeper and critical theory. Two authors talk about this within the book. Haskell talks about the concept of unconscious racial bias has been debunked as unscientific nonsense. And yet this is prevalent in our institutions. That inconvenient truth is ignored by its proponents as they relentlessly push specific rituals meant to expiate this hidden sin. A key ritual of penance is the act of checking one's privilege. Moving on, he talks about the white privilege theory. It's an ideology teaching students that if you are white, your successes are not achieved through personal effort, but they've been bestowed upon you simply because of the color of your skin. Conversely, those who are not white, their chances are diminished. So it doesn't matter how you slice it. Everyone has a grievance. So if you're not white, well, too bad for you. You poor thing. But if you are white, it's like, well, how dare you be a success? So it doesn't matter how you slice it. It's a lose-lose, negative. Frankly, I would call it a wicked ideology, because nobody benefits, and it does not lead to charity. Charitableness does not lead to love, does not lead to grace, does not lead to peace, and in a prosperous, productive coexistence. So Bruce Pardy dives into, and we won't go into the weeds here for sure, but he gives what he calls the four apocalyptic horses of critical theory, and how it's not merely one doctrine, but there's multiple doctrines within that. So it is, in some senses, one of the richest chapters in the book. It's quite early on, which may have actually not been very strategic because it may overwhelm some readers because it does get a bit academic, but it's a great piece. Yeah, just talking about the threats to reason, the threats to science, all the rest of it that come from critical theory. As political tools, this is important. As political tools, critical theory and its variations are brilliant. Any challenge to their legitimacy can be interpreted as a demonstration of their thesis. The assertion of reason, logic, and evidence is a manifestation of religion power. Thus, any challenger risks the stigma of a bigoted oppressor. James Lindsay, who's an expert in critical theory, he calls this a Kafka trap. Notice race? Well, that's because you're a racist. You don't notice race? Well, that's because you're privileged and thus racist. So if you deny that you are a witch, well, of course you're a witch. And if
Yeah.
you do not deny it, well, then you're a witch for sure. So pointing out that critical theory makes no sense misses the point. Making sense is Western and privileged.
Uh, And Dave, just note that he's a professor of law at Queen's.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, Bruce Party is a constitutional
That's a
legal expert.
key figure here. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, yes. No, no. Bruce Party is a scholar of Canadian constitutional law. Brilliant man. He's one of our senior fellows. Does great work. Yes. Okay, so that's the problem. So now let's look at who actually has been canceled, namely pretty much all of our founders, and let's look at some of the nuance, some of the complexity in that history. So let's unpack a little bit of it. So John Robson as a chapter, let's just kind of set the floor,
Right.
just in terms of being rooted in reality, the value of knowing our history. So our founders, our Canadian fathers of Confederation, they saw defects in their institutions. Of course they did. But they knew where Parliament, independent courts, and individual rights came from and how dramatically they outperformed even French institutions, let alone those of Russia or China of the time. They valued the organic way such institutions had evolved rather than being handed down from Parnassus by advanced thinkers lacking practical experience. We should be so lucky to have their depth of historical recollection. Continuing on this, talking about our assumed imperfections and going all the way back to Magna Carta to Confederation. The men who made Canada believed they were building a free country on the most solid foundation available, available being the key word. Indeed, the only one, Magna Carta's limitations on absolute power and the institutions that had developed based on it. If such men could somehow be transported to the 21st century only to be told they and their creation were imperfect, they'd be baffled that anyone would expect otherwise. They knew the limitations of human nature all too well. Pause and think about when Canada was confederated, 2 years following the American Civil War. And when Manifest Destiny was in full swing, Alaska is purchased in March. We are founded in July. We can't divorce Canada's confederation from the American Civil War. Looking at the US Civil War, they say, okay, well, we don't want that. Neither do we want exactly what is in Europe. But given reality, given what we're working with, let's build the best foundation we possibly can, knowing every institution is imperfect. Excuse me. They knew the limitations of human nature all too well, but which our modern utopians often disregard exactly that in planning the future or even in rewriting the past. Greg Piasecki, brilliant lawyer in Toronto, who quite possibly is the foremost expert on Sir John A. Macdonald as it relates to Indigenous affairs and to residential schools. He's really spent years going deep, 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 deep on this file. And anything by him on this is worth reading in National Post, C2C Journal, elsewhere, including our own sources. But in one of his pieces, and I forget which outlet it is, you can Google it, he asks a provocative question. Which prime minister saved the most Indigenous lives? Mr. Cancellation himself, Sir John A. Macdonald, the one that everyone, the statue is it. Correct me if I'm wrong, Ontarians. It's still boarded up at Queen's Park, correct? Oh, sorry, can't hear you, Don.
It was removed from downtown Hamilton as well. My
Okay,
apology, please.
okay, and I don't think Victoria's put it back up yet either. So looking at Sir John A, proper and balanced consideration of Macdonald's life as it was actually lived reveals that through his own actions and policies, not by accident, Canada's first prime minister was directly and deliberately responsible for saving the lives of untold numbers of Indigenous people. If you read the chapter in the book, Greg provides the receipts, and he does provide hard numbers as well of what we can calculate. It's extraordinary how many lives he went out of his way to make sure that he saved. Regarding things like vaccinations and major diseases, there were famines that were happening and making sure they didn't starve. All those kind of issues. And what's extraordinary is that he was opposed by the opposition in Parliament on many of those factors, and yet Sir John A was their great defender. So setting the record straight on residential schools, and of course that is a messy issue. We're not going to for a second pretend that that was a very poor government policy, but let's again judge it justly. The first such schools, so residential schools, appeared in Canada in 1695, long before Macdonald's tenure. And their application to Western Canada cannot be properly regarded as a government plot to permanently eliminate Native culture, which is what I was told in grad school. Under the seven numbered treaties, the federal government was obligated to build and staff such schools only when requested to do so by Native leaders, or as Treaty 6 clearly states, whenever the Indians of the reserve shall desire it. And attendance was entirely, this is key, entirely voluntary. Although the progressive movement across North America was pushing governments everywhere to make schooling universally compulsory, Macdonald resisted this for Native children. Without parental support, he believed, Native education would not succeed. Accordingly, it was left up to Native parents to decide whether their offspring should go to school. Now, could there have been exceptions? Were there exceptions? Sure, absolutely. This was the intent. This is what he worked very hard to achieve. Imperfectly, but worked hard. That's the record. Okay, moving on to Egerton Ryerson, another one that Toronto just can't get enough of canceling. If Ryerson University's Board of Governors and statue toppling vandals knew little, even just a little, about the man that they want to erase from downtown Toronto, it is not because historical records are lacking. The first biography of Ryerson was published in a series called The Makers of Canada in 1906. Maker was a particularly apt description for him, for he was the pioneer of free public education, when the other provinces and even the United Kingdom still only had fee-paying schools. His friendship with Indigenous people and promotion of their interests was another valuable contribution. This critical part of Ryerson's record makes the renaming of the university so egregious and wrong-headed. The Mississaugas of the credit were Ojibwe or Chippewa speaking, and Ryerson quickly began to learn their language. He loved his time with them. He was young and sturdy, lived in a wigwam at the start, and later moved into the home of a school teacher and his family. He was soon made a brother by a chief and given an Ojibwe name, Chihawk, which means bird on a wing. So that's the record. Like, and this stuff isn't actually that hard to dig up, and yet you're canceling this guy because he wasn't friendly enough to the Indigenous peoples. It's beyond absurd. Beyond absurd. Okay, another one. Judge Begbie. So if Canada, and again, please get the book, get all the details. But Begbie has been given a really bad name. If Canada is prepared to fully exonerate 6 war chiefs, which we did, for horrific actions we now consider to have been honorable and reasoned, then we surely owe the same to Sir Matthew Begbie, who was by colonial standards the most liberal, open-minded, and minority-positive jurist of his day, and even by modern standards remains arguably the most impressive figure ever to wield a gavel in Canada. His golden reputation is further burnished by the fact he was not just an impeccably fair purveyor of law and order, but he again, like all these guys that we just mentioned, was an early proponent of Native rights. He learned several Native dialects in order to adjudicate without need of interpreters, again, to be just. He frequently refused to enforce culturally insensitive laws, such as the infamous potlatch ban, exhibited much sympathy for the damage done to natives by whiskey sellers, and in 1860 he spoke in favor of the then heretical notion of Indian title to the land. So Judge Begbie canceled because of his treatment of 6 chiefs. But yet when you judge him in context, you actually zoom in, you realize, no, this guy went out of his way to judge Indigenous peoples justly, as best as he could. Again, does that mean he was perfect? Well, sorry, I'm not yet perfect. I don't think any of you are yet either. Okay, Halifax, since the 90s, has been trying to cancel its founding father, Edward Cornwallis. And the new name, so they renamed Cornwallis Park in Halifax to Peace and Friendship Park. Let's fast forward here. The new name of this park is Orwellian. There's neither peace nor friendship when one side attacks historical figures with misinformation while the other attempts to defend the historical record. Let's pause for a second. Truth and reconciliation. To have reconciliation, you need truth. And if you seek to reconcile, you do not cancel the other side. Reconciliation does not seek to rename. the icons, the monuments, the figures of the other side. No, if you're reconciling, you're coming together. You're not canceling the other side. So with all of this, and again, I'm not saying there shouldn't be truth and reconciliation. There absolutely should be, 100%. But it needs to be done truthfully, and reconciliation needs to be real, genuine reconciliation. Cancel culture is the opposite of that. So this very much applies not just to Edward Cornwallis, but to all the figures we've talked about. So anti-colonial activists waging war on Canada's history seek to impose a Manichaean worldview, like a Gnostic worldview, where all historical figures are either good or bad, but never both. So a very simplistic black and white way of seeing the world with no nuance. In the Canadian context, in blunt terms, that means Indigenous good, colonist bad. But let us pause on such a simplistic divide, because informed history, nuanced facts, and then apologies are in order. This is a fun chapter. Janice Fiamengo talking about, and she's awesome, by the way, on almost anything she talks about early Canadian women. This is fun. The common narrative today is that Canadian women, like other women in the Anglophone world, were treated as second-class citizens back in the day. They lacked the right to vote, were confined to domestic drudgery, were barely even considered persons, and were generally excluded from the opportunities for free self-realization and participatory nation building that their brothers, husbands, and sons possessed. Canadian men, in contrast, were allegedly privileged by society that extended them many unearned sex-based advantages. This formulation is not only simplistic, it's outright inaccurate. Under pioneering conditions, the traditional division of labor between outdoor, which is for men, and indoor, which is for female, was not a matter of sexism. No, it was practical reality. Men did the harshly physical work that pregnant or nursing women could not attempt without danger to their health and that of their unborn or young children. It was all too common for men to die felling trees, burning agricultural fields, or in storms at sea. And she gets into the details. Like, it's a thorough chapter. She makes a very strong case. Like, no, this was not sexism, folks. It was frankly the opposite of that. It was caring. Um, Chris Champion, this too, an excellent chapter talking about the British Empire, because again, what was Canada? It was almost in many senses more British than the British. We were British North America, and I would argue that's also a big part of our identity crisis is we're no longer British North America. We've even scraped that, called our constitution the can't what is it what did we rename it to? It used to be called the British North America Act. We've renamed ourselves. We no longer wanted to identify that way. And he talks about one of his books, his own separate book. I'll give a quick plug, called The Strange Death or the Strange Demise of British Canada. Very interesting book. But here he makes the case for, again, that Britishness, and how that's not an ethnic label. And Sam Sullivan, dig up some of his videos. The channel's called Cumtux on YouTube. Sam Sullivan has multiple videos getting into this, how to be British actually has a very multicultural connotation, because the English are their own peoples, the Welsh are their own peoples, the Scotch, the Irish, but to be British, it's bringing all of them together, right? So it's focusing on the institutions, the liberties, parliament, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So on the British Empire, contemporary people too easily fall into what they assume is good progressive thinking, but whose origin is actually Leninist dogma. Namely, that colonialism was a morbid phase of capitalist exploitation, the last ditch attempt of the rich to cheat the poor and of the white to oppress the non-white. In reality, however, some empires, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and others in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia, previous centuries, they did take a spoils approach, while others, like the British, progressively developed their colonies economically and politically. Another great book here is Daniel Hannan's Inventing Freedom, where he gets into there's two types of colonialism. Those that were expanding the crown tended to be, regardless of nation, they were expanding the crown, they tend to be oppressive and take advantage of people. And in the British sense, you do see that in India, you do see that in Barbados, Africa, those places. But then there were those who were fleeing the crown, and they tended to bring free institutions with them and freedom with them, Canada being a prime example of that. On slavery's abolition, again, staying on the British Empire theme, it irks progressives terribly that the heroes of anti-slavery, champions of freedom and natural rights, were 18th century small c conservatives, namely liberals, Whigs, Tories, Baptists, and evangelical Christians like William Wilberforce, was quite deservedly lionized in a recent film of him. Wilberforce was but a schoolboy when the Chief Justice of the King's Bench ruled slavery odious and illegal in England, but By the 1780s, having grown into a fashionable rake, Wilberforce was elected to Parliament, underwent an evangelical conversion, and joined the movement to abolish the trade and reform the morals of his nation. What's remarkable about the British Empire is not that injustices were present on many occasions, but that they were opposed vehemently and often successfully from within. Can anyone seriously maintain if the Europeans had never colonized North America or Africa without Christianity in their wake, that indigenous peoples would have abolished the slaving practices that were endemic to their cultures? We'll be releasing a study in August that gives much more detail on the slavery that was practiced here in North America. Canada has had slavery for most of its history, and no, it was not slavery like what was in the States, and no, it was not slavery imposed by the British or the colonists. Or that the Aztecs would have ended their ritual cannibalism and human sacrifice. What of the Aztecs' neighbors, the Chimu, whose recently excavated mass grave contained more than 140 child victims found with their hearts removed, having been sacrificed to stop bad weather? Would that have ended had we not arrived? So that's the history, and adding a bit of nuance, a bit of context. So now, what's the path forward? And there's still a few things that will be flagged along the way, but how do we renew Canada? First and foremost, um, what led to the abolition of slavery in the British Empire? And I would put a quick caveat here that this caveat is not presented in the book, but this was the second abolition of slavery, because slavery is the norm throughout human history. Whatever tribe, whatever culture, almost even the ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans, who were supposedly civilized, they had slavery. Slavery was rampant. You do see slavery abolished in the Roman Empire with the rise of Christianity, and it does come to an end. And it's reemerged. It reemerges in the Renaissance with a return to, like, there was a neo-paganist movement that brought it back. That's also when you see racism emerge. You cannot find ancient documents that identify someone's race. Saint Augustine of Hippo, we don't know what color of skin he had. He's technically from Africa, but from the Mediterranean, North Africa. Was he olive colored? Was he black? Was he white? We don't know, because you don't have that level of specification. You don't have peculiarities documented until you get to modernity. I think it's the 14 and 1500s. It's with the Renaissance and the secular humanism that came out of that, and the neo-paganism. That's when all of a sudden race is something that's really focused on and becomes a justification for slavery. So slavery is actually reintroduced. That's one thing missing from the book that I wish had been a part of the peer review process. That would have been covered, but that's one gap in that chapter. Is that this is the second abolition, and both times slavery has been abolished essentially globally. Both times the common denominator is Christianity. Okay, so students in our increasingly secular country, taught in secular schools, and I would say sectarian secular schools, learn little about one of the most powerful forces for abolition in Western history, religion. And this, by the way, is written by a Jew. Yet from its inception, the abolitionist movement was rooted in Christianity. The first to conclude as early as the 1670s that holding slaves was against God's will were the Quakers. Actually, well, even that. We got a lot of Catholic documentation as well, even earlier than that. But yes, who began to urge their co-religionists not to keep slaves, deeply immersed in the Hebrew scriptures. Protestant abolitionists in Britain and the States filled their anti-slavery tracts with biblical references. That is true. So on slavery, talking about our shared humanity, I kind of flipped that here, because the shared humanity isn't in the good sense. It's the fact that all human beings are flawed. Every culture is flawed. Every society is flawed. When it comes to enslaving our fellow human beings, there are no ethnic saints and no racial sinners, just human beings. Europeans enslaved Africans, but they purchased them from Africans who captured them upriver. The Nootka of the west coast of Canada, near where I am, and the Maliseet of the east massacred, tortured, and enslaved Europeans. Okay, Joseph Brant enslaved blacks. As Americans were enslaving Africans to pick cotton on southern plantations, the Ottoman rulers of Egypt were importing slaves from Nubia for the same work. The list, as we've seen, goes on and on and on and on. And again, we have a study coming out. It'll be coming out in August. Really gets into the details of this. Teaching that slavery was universally practiced immerses students in factual, not romanticized history, which presently students are coming out of, not only grade 12, but also at a university, with a very negative view of Canada, of the West, of our institutions, because they're only taught a cherry-picked history with all of our faults, all of our grievances, not taught in context, which again, if you were to judge Canada in context, we almost always were better than our peers. Okay. And then the new racism. Jamil Javani has a whole chapter here. We've done other work on this as well, but talking about how what's called anti-racism today is in fact racism. And to summarize, it goes so far as if you take a colorblind approach, so the Martin Luther King approach, where judge someone on the conduct of the character, not the color of their skin, well, that now, by definition, is racism because you're not actively working to combat racism. So just being colorblind is not enough. That makes you a racist. The anti-racist movement insists you must be actively an activist. And really what it is it's a form of racism. And Jamil Javani goes into the details there. And also the importance of courage in that, especially as a Black Canadian, it's actually very hard to speak on these issues because a Black Canadian who speaks up on this stuff gets more attacked than anybody else. And he has very much learned that from experience. He was canceled by Bell Media. I'm not sure what came of that lawsuit, but he's now a member of Parliament and he's doing very well. Equality under the law. Okay, this is we'll wrap up pretty quickly here, but this is a case from up in the Yukon where some Indigenous Canadians were not given equality under the law because they're, if you identify as Indigenous, certain laws apply. If you don't, other laws apply. So we'll skip over that, get into the details in the chapter, but that's a genuine question in our country right now. Everyone on this call knows the importance of the rule of law, the importance of lady justice having a blindfold, and how important that is for justice. And in our country, that blindfold has been completely ripped off, beginning with the charter, but then just it's ramped up big time ever since. And this whole chapter is dedicated to one very particular and very troublesome example of that. And the point being, we need to return to equality under the law, where every individual is treated as an individual, regardless of color, sex, all the rest of it. Put the blindfold back on, look at the case on its merits, judge accordingly. Because that presently is not the case in our country. Also, returning to subsidiarity. How the First Nations communities in particular are grossly over-governed by a nanny state, and how destructive that has been for Indigenous peoples. Joseph Quinnell is himself Indigenous, and he has a whole chapter talking about that. And of course, the principle of subsidiarity, I assume all of you know, it's decisions should be made as close to those affected by those decisions as possible. That's a very simplistic explanation. He also talks about how some very positive signs of an economic spring amongst First Nations, where First Nations have changed in recent decades because a growing urban middle class formed from members exposed to the way in which the rest of Canada lives, they're beginning to prosper. So they support certain constitutional rights for their communities, but are much more open to voluntary change and want democratic governance and prosperity. In addition, Indigenous leaders have emerged who have galvanized Indigenous support for change, very positive change. They've challenged the so-called Aboriginal orthodoxy. We're seeing very positive changes happening. Indigenous communities, very importantly, not all ideas are created equal. This is a quote also worth sharing. Ever since my older son started university in Canada, I've been increasingly worried that Canadian culture has become a petri dish for dangerous and virulent thinking, where the dominant discourse asserts that every claim of oppression should be acknowledged as fact, and every culture treated as if it were equally important to the Canadian mosaic and indistinguishable from the foundational beliefs of the majority that created Canada's original story and institutions. But we know that not all ideas are created equal, and we'll expand on that in the next slide. It's a very interesting point that Jaswell makes is that among my correspondents, the group that most fiercely disputed the view that minorities in Canada are subject to indignities were minorities themselves. The most vocal and heartfelt defense of Canada comes from, for the most part, first-generation immigrants, whether they arrived 50 years ago or in the last 5 years. So Canada should be the land of opportunity. We are, and there's just data here showing Canada is the most welcoming of any nation to immigrants, regardless of political party, regardless of whether you're urban, rural. Canada is by far the most open to immigration, and for good reason. We have a new study coming out asking, do we have too much of a good thing in that housing policy, the supply of housing development has made it difficult to accommodate all the immigrants. So like the number of immigrant arrivals to the number of new housing starts presently is 5-1. That's not sustainable, and it's been rising very steeply for the last decade. So Yeah, so in part the negative attitude toward immigrants that you're seeing in our country is because we've had anything but common sense policy. But Canada at its core has always been a very pro-immigration nation for very good reason. But there's a few studies we have coming out that tease out the nuances of that as well. But all that leading up to here, ideas have consequences. Ideas can change the trajectory of individuals and even entire nations. From Adam Smith's notion of the invisible hand, which helped spread free market ideas and prosperity, to the exact opposite notions of Karl Marx, which spurred revolutions, repression, and entrenched poverty, and frankly, the loss of hundreds of millions of lives. To religious conceptions of any variety which have anchored cultures, ideas affect how people see and govern themselves and each other. Ideas have impacts that outlast armies and empires, which is why as a think tank, that's our theory of culture change, is start with the ideas, get those ideas out there. That's the root of change. So in closing, final three slides, ideas, not identities, are what we need to focus on. That's the path forward in simplest form. States founded on civic nationalism are based on an idea with rights and responsibilities attached to the individual. Um, uh, Also, the importance of individuals in law and policy. So, unlike his son, Pierre Trudeau grasped that tribalism based in unchangeable characteristics has been the norm in human history, which is why citizens must instead consciously think of each other as individuals first and define each other that way in law and policy if they're to avoid the unresolvable conflicts that arise between collectives. And of course, what is tribalism? It is not that collective action is always invalid, but the point of collective action in a liberal state is that when a government passes a law or creates a policy, or when a court imposes a sanction or a sentence, such measures should apply equally to all, regardless of whether one's black, white, or indigenous, and I'd insert purple, rich or poor, a woman or a man, French or English, and 1,000 other possible ways in which people can be defined. Last slide. My advice to newcomers, and this is from someone who herself used to be an immigrant and has been, I think, here for 30, maybe 40 years. My advice to newcomers: do not upend Canada with anti-individual group preferences pushed upon you by those pretending to speak on your behalf. They act as if they know what's best for you and me. They impose their sectarian ideology on both of us while claiming to speak in our names, while obsessing over diversity. It is not simpler, wiser, and safer. Is it not simpler, wiser, and safer for us newcomers to celebrate our love for our adoptive country and love it back? That is far better than endorsing ideologies, which, when pushed to the extreme, may risk weakening, paralyzing, and even potentially destroying the Canada we came to in order to escape the effect of such similar destructive ideas on the countries of our